You weren't imagining it. Life got harder. Groceries, rent, gas. Everything quietly climbed while your paycheck stayed the same. It didn't start with greed or policy. It started with a virus that shattered the rhythm of the world. This is the story of how COVID broke the system and why we're still paying for it. In early 2020, the world didn't just slow down, it slammed into a wall. The kind of global economic stop we saw in March 2020 wasn't just rare, it was unthinkable. For decades, we'd built our world on the assumption that the economy is like a heartbeat, always moving, always flowing. Even during recessions, the pulse never flatlines completely. But COVID changed that. It wasn't a financial crash like 2008. It wasn't a supply-side crisis like the oil shocks of the 1970s. It wasn't even a war-driven disruption like World War II. It was something entirely new. A globally synchronized, government-mandated shutdown of both production and consumption. Borders closed, flights were grounded, factories halted, restaurants locked their doors, offices went remote overnight. Millions of people were told, stay home. From one moment to the next, the economy shifted from full throttle to emergency brakes, and not in one country, but in nearly every economy across the globe. This wasn't a slowdown, it was an intentional pause on capitalism. First, let's look at the supply side. Supply chains, the systems that produce and distribute nearly everything we consume, were built for efficiency, not resilience. That's important. In the years leading up to the pandemic, companies streamlined operations with a model called just-in-time inventory. It meant goods arrived exactly when needed, no sooner, no later. It saved money, it improved margins. It looked great on balance sheets, but it also meant there was no slack, no buffer, no room for error. So when the virus hit China, then Italy, then the US, then the world, factories closed, shipments stopped, ports clogged up, and warehouses emptied. The machine stopped moving. And without raw materials, intermediate goods and finished products flowing through the system, entire sectors came to a standstill. Now here's the twist. In most economic crises, like the Great Depression or the 2008 crash, the problem is a collapse in demand. People stop spending, businesses stop investing, unemployment rises, recession sets in, and for a few weeks, in March 2020, it looked like that was happening. Markets crashed, people lost jobs, businesses closed. Panic was in the air, but then something unprecedented happened. Governments stepped in, not slowly but massively. They injected trillions of dollars into their economies fast. The US passed the CARES Act, direct cash payments, expanded unemployment, small business support. Canada launched CERB and CEBUs. The EU deployed emergency relief funds. Central banks slashed interest rates, opened emergency lending facilities and bought up bonds like never before. We had seen stimulus before, but never like this. This was a floodgate, not a faucet. And it worked, at least in the short term. Savings soared, stock markets rebounded, spending returned. But now we had something strange. Demand had been propped up, even supercharged, while supply was still broken. Think about that. People had money. They wanted to buy things, but the things weren't there to buy. That imbalance, it's the first spark of inflation. To the average person, 2020 didn't feel like inflation at first. It felt like fear, scarcity, uncertainty. But underneath that, the seeds were being planted. Supply shock, fewer goods, fewer services, demand injection, more cash, more credit. Psychological shift, a world population forced to pause and reevaluate what matters. For a brief moment, everything was suspended. The economy, work, travel, school, commutes, expectations, entire industries. But when the world came back online, it didn't restart where it left off. It came back out of sync. Some sectors surged, others lagged. Some people thrived, others struggled. Some companies adapted, others disappeared. The economic engine started again, but with strange noises, misfires, warning lights. And over the next 12 to 24 months, those strange signals would become loud and impossible to ignore. You probably don't think about shipping containers when you open your phone, brew your coffee, or sit on your couch, but in 2020, those silent background systems, the ships, warehouses, truck routes, air freight lanes, assembly lines, suddenly came into focus because when COVID hit, it didn't just affect people, it paralyzed the hidden architecture that moves the modern world. Let's start with something simple. Imagine you order a laptop online, you click buy now, and expect it in a few days. But that laptop didn't start at a local store. It began months earlier, possibly in 5 or 6 different countries. Rare earth minerals from Africa, microchips from Taiwan, screen assembly in South Korea, final build in China, packed, loaded, and shipped to a port, carried by freighter across the Pacific, unloaded, customs cleared, warehoused, and trucked to your city. That's a supply chain, a chain of dependencies stretching across the globe, optimized down to the hour. It works until it doesn't. When the pandemic struck, the global supply system didn't bend. It broke. Factories closed to prevent outbreaks, ports shut down or ran skeleton crews, containers piled up in the wrong places, shipping rates quadrupled if you could even book space. Truck drivers and warehouse workers stayed home, got sick or quit entirely. And here's the terrifying truth. There was no backup plan, no buffer, no redundancy, no playbook for a worldwide logistics meltdown because we built these systems for speed and cost efficiency, not flexibility. And when things got unpredictable, that efficiency became a weakness. Let's look at what this meant in real life. Toilet paper vanished, not because we ran out, but because stores weren't stocked for panic buying. Semiconductors dried up, shutting down auto plants, delaying iPhones, and making used cars more expensive than new ones. Lumber prices tripled as DIY home projects collided with mill slowdowns, exercise equipment, webcams, desks. Simple items became hard to find and expensive. What began as a supply disruption turned into a psychological feedback loop. When people see scarcity, they hoard. When they hoard, demand spikes. When demand spikes, supply chains fall even further behind. Scarcity breeds more scarcity. A single image came to define this collapse. Ships stuck offshore, waiting weeks to dock. In Los Angeles, in Rotterdam, in Shanghai. Cargo vessels sat idle, full of goods, unable to unload. Why? Because containers were stuck in the wrong places. Ports were short-staffed, trucks weren't available, warehouses were full. And because shipping works on a tight schedule, a delay in one place cascades across the entire network. A late delivery in China means a missed truck in Kansas, which means no inventory at a store in Vancouver. The chain broke link by link. Of all the supply chain crises, semiconductors hit the hardest. These tiny, intricate chips are inside everything. Phones, cars, refrigerators, TVs, game consoles, credit cards, and chip manufacturing is both highly technical and highly concentrated. Taiwan produces over 60% of the world's chips. A handful of factories, like TSMC, supply the globe. The equipment to make them, it's controlled by one Dutch company, ASML. So when even one chip plant went offline, it disrupted industries everywhere. Car manufacturers had to shut down production, not for lack of metal, but for lack of a few $10 microchips. This was the Achilles heel of globalization. The more streamlined and interconnected the system, the more vulnerable it becomes to shock. Now let's connect it back to inflation. When it costs more to ship a container, pay for scarce materials, wait on components, store goods that are delayed, those costs don't disappear. They get passed to you. This is what economists call cost-push inflation. It's when the cost of making and moving goods increases and businesses raise prices to stay profitable. And because these shocks were global, so was the inflation. It wasn't just your local coffee shop charging more. It was the global food system, tech system, transport system, all straining at once. In the end, COVID didn't create fragile supply chains, it just exposed them. We optimized for speed, profit, and just-in-time delivery at the expense of robustness. We had no surge capacity, no domestic production, no room for error, and when the first domino fell, the rest followed. By 2021, supply chain issues weren't just technical, they became political. Governments talked about reshoring and economic resilience. Companies reconsidered local manufacturing. Consumers realized Amazon Prime wasn't magic. The illusion of smooth, invisible global commerce shattered, and as prices continued to rise, it became clear this wasn't temporary. The world's economic engine was fundamentally out of sync. In most recessions, people stop spending. Fear kicks in, budgets tighten, credit card bills go unpaid, shopping slows. But the COVID recession was different. Because even as stores closed and economies froze, money didn't stop moving. In fact, in some places it moved more than ever. Why? Because while the supply side of the economy collapsed, the demand side was quietly getting supercharged. And what came next wasn't just a recovery. It was a demand boom that economists didn't see coming. Let's rewind to the middle of 2020. People couldn't travel, couldn't go out to eat. Concerts, conferences, clubs, all cancelled. No vacations, no weddings, no live sports, and yet people kept spending. But not on experiences, on stuff. Home offices, gaming setups, new TVs, air fryers, DIY renovations, bicycles, pelotons, loungewear, crypto, stocks. Retail therapy met lockdown boredom and collided with global stimulus. What should have been a demand collapse turned into a reshuffling of spending, and the numbers were staggering. Governments didn't just throw out lifelines, they threw out lifeboats. In the US, 3 rounds of direct stimulus checks hit tens of millions of households. In Canada, CERB payments kept workers and students afloat. Across Europe, wage subsidies, rent freezes, and business grants injected liquidity. At the same time, interest rates dropped to near zero, making borrowing cheap. Mortgage deferrals gave homeowners breathing room. Stock markets recovered rapidly, making many people feel richer. And then came crypto. Millions of people sitting at home got curious. They downloaded Coinbase, bought Ethereum, watched Dogecoin spike. Suddenly, there was money and momentum. Everywhere. Household savings soared, debt dropped, and people were ready to spend. Stuck inside, people went online. What started as convenience became necessity. E-commerce sales skyrocketed across every category. Amazon's quarterly profits doubled. Shopify stores exploded. Grocery delivery went mainstream. Apps like DoorDash, Instacart, and Uber Eats became lifelines. And this wasn't just a shift in shopping, it was a structural acceleration of digital behavior. What economists thought would take 5 to 10 years to evolve, happened in 5 months. And with this shift came a new kind of demand, high frequency, high velocity, on-demand spending, but the supply system couldn't keep up, so backlogs formed. Wait times stretched, and prices rose. Psychology plays a massive role in inflation, and this was a perfect storm for demand-driven panic. Remember, people had money. Stores had empty shelves, delivery delays were everywhere, and so the message became buy now, stock up, get yours before it's gone. This behavior fed directly into demand-pull inflation, a classic case of too many dollars chasing too few goods. From computer monitors to couches, demand outpaced supply, and prices rose not just because costs were higher, but because people were willing to pay more to skip the wait. Retailers saw this and adjusted. Dynamic pricing algorithms kicked in. Prices didn't just reflect cost, they reflected urgency. There's another twist. By late 2021, something even weirder emerged: revenge spending. People were sick of restrictions, tired of waiting, ready to live again, and so when borders opened and restrictions eased, even slightly, demand surged. Travel bookings spiked, concerts sold out, restaurants overflowed, events that hadn't happened in years all returned at once. This created a second wave of inflation, not for goods, but for services. Plane tickets doubled, hotel rooms tripled, Taylor Swift tickets, forget it. Economists began calling it funflation, the kind of pent-up demand you get when people are emotionally ready to spend no matter the cost. Here's the kicker. Inflation isn't just caused by price increases, it's amplified by expectations. When people think prices will rise, they buy early. That early buying increases demand, which pushes prices up, validating the belief. So they buy even earlier next time. This self-fulfilling loop is called an inflationary spiral, and during COVID it became very real. Consumers changed how and when they spent. Retailers changed how and when they priced. Investors changed how and where they allocated capital, and all of it happened faster than any economic model predicted. The demand boom wasn't just unexpected, it broke the usual rules. And with the supply system still broken, this demand wasn't met with product, it was met with higher prices. In every economic crisis, there's always one big question. What happens to the jobs? When COVID-19 hit, that question became an emergency. Overnight, entire sectors of employment vanished. Restaurants shut down, hotels emptied, retail stores locked their doors, theaters, airports, gyms, all silent. And within just a few weeks, in early 2020, the labor market experienced one of the fastest collapses in modern history. In the US alone, over 20 million people filed for unemployment in a single month. That's not a typo. That's a full-blown labor shock. But here's the twist. As the economy reopened, many of those jobs came back, but the workers didn't. What followed was a strange, frustrating, and deeply revealing chapter of the pandemic economy, one that would push wages, disrupt industries, and quietly contribute to inflation in ways we're still unpacking today. As lockdowns eased, employers expected workers to return, but across North America and much of the world, millions of people didn't come back. Restaurants couldn't hire servers, airports couldn't find baggage handlers, retailers posted job openings and got silence. And the headlines started rolling in. Nobody wants to work anymore. But that was never the full story, because this wasn't just a labor shortage, it was a labor reset. Here's what really happened. Millions of frontline workers, nurses, retail clerks, delivery drivers, factory employees spent months under stress, exposed to risk without enough support. Many hit a wall, some left temporarily, others left for good. COVID didn't just take lives, it took emotional reserves, and for countless workers the pandemic clarified one thing: this job isn't worth it anymore. When schools closed, childcare became a full-time job, and disproportionately, it fell on women. Millions of mothers left the workforce not by choice, but by necessity. Elder care needs rose too. This invisible labor had a massive economic cost and reduced workforce participation for months, especially among working-class and middle-income households. For older workers, COVID was a wake-up call. Facing health risks and volatile work conditions, many chose to retire early. Some withdrew from the workforce permanently, reshaping the labor pool, and others, of all ages, used the pandemic pause to rethink their path. Is this what I want to do? Is this worth my time, stress, or health? What's next? The result was what came to be called the Great Resignation, a wave of voluntary job exits that continued well into 2022. COVID restrictions didn't just close schools and businesses, they also slowed immigration, especially in industries that rely heavily on foreign labor: agriculture, construction, elder care, tech. This added a silent but powerful pressure to the labor supply. Fewer workers available for essential roles equals higher wage pressure. As businesses scrambled to hire, the labor market flipped temporarily in favor of workers. Job openings soared, signing bonuses appeared, wages jumped across food service, warehousing, transportation, hospitality. Unions started gaining power again. On paper, this looked like good news. And for many workers, it was the first real bargaining power they'd seen in years. But two problems were brewing beneath the surface. While frontline service jobs saw spikes in hourly pay, white-collar salaries remained mostly flat. Meanwhile, prices kept climbing, and wage growth couldn't keep up with inflation, especially in rent, gas, and food. By late 2022, real wages, adjusted for inflation, were actually falling for many workers, even if their nominal wages rose. Higher wages equal higher operating costs, and in many industries, instead of absorbing the cost, companies passed it along to you. A $2 per hour wage hike might not seem like much until you multiply it across thousands of workers, rising supply costs, and a margin-obsessed shareholder base. So businesses raised prices, menu prices, delivery fees, cleaning services, streaming subscriptions. Labor inflation became consumer inflation. For a moment, it looked like workers had won something: autonomy, leverage, higher pay. But as central banks raised interest rates to cool inflation, the pressure flipped back. Companies cut back, job growth slowed, layoffs began in tech, media, and finance, and the balance of power began to tilt again toward employers. The paradox: workers demanded more, earned more, and still fell behind, because when inflation rises faster than your paycheck, you feel poorer, even if you technically earn more. This part of the inflation story is less visible but deeply human. COVID didn't just change the labor market, it changed how people relate to work itself. People stopped tolerating low wages and abusive conditions. Flexibility became a top priority. Work-life balance wasn't just a perk, it was a demand. And this psychological shift disrupted how quickly the labor market could go back to normal. Spoiler, it never did. To recap, the labor market created inflation through four channels. Wage-driven inflation: companies raised wages and passed costs to consumers. Service sector shortages. Fewer workers meant slower service, which led to higher prices. Mismatch between openings and skills. Jobs existed, but not always where people were ready to work. Worker exit and bargaining power. With fewer people willing to accept old norms, businesses had to sweeten the deal, and that deal cost more. And all of this unfolded while demand kept rising and supply chains were still broken. By 2022, it was already bad. Prices were rising, supply chains were clogged, the labor market was tight, consumer demand was still elevated. But just as inflation started to seem manageable, just when the world was learning to walk again, something else hit. Not another virus, not a new policy, a war. On February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. It was Europe's biggest military conflict since World War II, and it sent immediate shockwaves through the global economy. At first glance, the link between war and inflation might not seem obvious. But the connections were deep, powerful, and immediate, because Russia and Ukraine aren't just any countries, they're energy giants, food exporters, metal producers, fertilizer suppliers. And when the tanks rolled in, global markets panicked. Russia is one of the world's largest oil and natural gas producers. Before the war, it supplied about 10% of global oil exports and over 40% of Europe's natural gas. So when sanctions hit and pipelines were threatened, energy markets exploded. Oil hit over $120 a barrel, levels not seen since the early 2000s. Natural gas prices in Europe quadrupled, triggering an energy crisis. Countries scrambled to replace Russian supplies, driving up costs everywhere. And here's the thing. Energy isn't just about heating homes or filling cars, it powers everything. Transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, shipping, plastics, logistics, and construction. When energy prices spike, so does everything else. This is called energy-led inflation, and it's one of the most painful kinds because it hits both producers and consumers at the same time. Ukraine is often called the breadbasket of Europe. Together, Russia and Ukraine accounted for 30% of global wheat exports and 20% of corn exports. Huge volumes of barley and sunflower oil, too. When war broke out, ports in Ukraine were blockaded, fields became battle zones, and farmers fled or were drafted. Global grain markets panicked. Simultaneously, Russia, under sanctions, cut exports of fertilizer, which is key for growing crops worldwide. Less fertilizer means lower yields, leading to higher food prices. Countries in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, heavily dependent on Ukrainian and Russian grain, were hit the hardest. The UN warned of a looming global food crisis. But even in developed countries, food inflation surged. Bread, cereal, meat, cooking oils, produce, grocery bills ballooned. Again, not because of greed, but because the global food system was choked by war. Russia is also a major exporter of industrial metals. Palladium, used in cars and electronics, nickel essential for batteries, and stainless steel aluminum, used across aerospace, construction and tech. When sanctions hit, those supply lines fractured. Prices spiked. Battery manufacturers, car makers, aerospace firms, they all felt the pressure. And once again, cost-push inflation rolled downhill to consumers. Sanctions are meant to punish governments, but they have consequences. As the West sanctioned Russia's banks, oligarchs and exports, Russia responded by cutting gas supplies to Europe, restricting fertilizer and grain exports, shifting trade towards China and India, and weaponizing access to critical resources. This led to a geopolitical energy scramble. Germany restarted coal plants, France ramped up nuclear, the United States tapped strategic oil reserves. Developing nations were priced out of global energy markets. And this fragmentation made everything more expensive, more chaotic, and more vulnerable to price shocks. Just like early COVID triggered panic buying of toilet paper, war triggered economic anxiety. People feared oil shortages, so they filled tanks early. Governments feared energy insecurity, so they overbought. Markets feared instability, so they hedged aggressively. These feedback loops didn't just reflect fear, they amplified it. And in economics, fear is expensive. When peace is uncertain, prices become volatile. And that volatility gets priced into everything from insurance to shipping to investment. You pay more not just for the goods, but for the risk of delay, disruption, or loss. Cargo ships rerouted, higher shipping costs, factories move operations, higher labor costs, capital flows out of unstable regions, higher financing costs, defense spending increases, less budget for social services. War doesn't just destroy cities, it rearranges the economic map. And in 2022, it turned post-pandemic inflation into something far more complex. A tangle of supply shocks, commodity crunches, political uncertainty, and global instability. As usual, the pain wasn't shared equally. Wealthy countries absorbed price increases with difficulty, but with buffers. Low-income nations faced food shortages, riots, and debt defaults. Middle-class families felt squeezed between rising bills and stagnant wages. The inflation sparked by war wasn't just economic, it was emotional. It bred frustration, finger-pointing, and polarization, and it layered onto a population already fatigued by years of disruption. By mid-2022, economists began using a new term, polycrisis. It described what was happening globally: a health crisis, a supply chain crisis, an inflation crisis, a geopolitical crisis, an energy crisis, a cost of living crisis, all connected, all overlapping, all feeding each other. COVID may have started the inflation fire, but war poured gasoline on it. By late 2022, the world had absorbed one economic gut punch after another. COVID froze the system, supply chains buckled, stimulus checks flowed, war disrupted energy, food and metals. Labor costs surged, so prices went up. That made sense. But then something strange happened. Prices kept going up, even after shipping rates dropped, even after fuel prices eased, even after supply chains started moving again, and in boardrooms around the world, earnings calls revealed something unexpected. Profits were booming. Yes, for many companies it was. You'd think inflation would squeeze margins, higher costs, lower demand, tighter wallets, but for some sectors, the opposite occurred. Oil and gas companies posted record earnings. Shipping giants like Maersk reported profits 10 times their pre-pandemic levels. Grocery conglomerates, packaged food brands, home improvement retailers all saw margin expansion. Even as households were tightening belts, corporate earnings soared. So what happened? Inflation creates chaos, and chaos creates cover. When everyone expects prices to rise and no one knows what's fair anymore, companies gain pricing power, the ability to raise prices without losing customers. Is your coffee more expensive because of beans or shipping or rent? Is your gym membership going up due to utilities or staff or just inflation? Consumers don't know. And in uncertain times, they don't question it. That's where opportunistic pricing creeps in. Not illegal, not unethical, strictly speaking, but strategic. Many companies blamed inflation for their own price hikes, but behind the scenes, analysts noticed something. Input costs rose 5%, prices rose 10%, profits rose 15%. That math doesn't lie. Executives used inflation as a narrative shield. We had to raise prices to protect margins. But in many cases, they were expanding margins because consumers were already primed to expect increases. Inflation wasn't just a cost to manage, it became a business strategy. This worked best in industries with low competition. If you're one of 3 major grocery chains, 2 telecom giants, 4 airline carriers, or 1 energy distributor in a region, you don't need to worry much about customers switching. And this is where consolidation matters. Over the past 30 years, many industries became increasingly dominated by fewer, larger players. Big tech, big pharma, big food, big oil, and big retail. In a consolidated market, prices don't need to reflect cost. They reflect what the market can bear. And during an inflation panic, the market can bear a lot. Not all inflation comes from higher sticker prices. Some comes from smaller portions and worse service. Enter shrinkflation, same price, less product. Think smaller cereal boxes, thinner paper towels. Skimpflation is same price, reduced quality. Think slower service, fewer staff. No amenities. These silent forms of inflation allow companies to protect profits without visibly raising prices. You feel it. You just can't prove it. And that makes it harder to fight. Let's be blunt. Most public companies are legally bound to prioritize shareholder value, not affordability, not fairness, not economic stability. So when inflation gave them an opening to boost revenues, rebuild margins, reward investors, they took it. Stock buybacks returned, dividends increased, executive compensation rose. Meanwhile, consumers were told to tighten their belts. This wasn't some grand conspiracy, but it was a systemic outcome of how corporate capitalism works. When uncertainty creates room to raise prices and accountability is weak, prices rise more than they need to. By 2023, institutions like the European Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Bank of England, all published research showing that corporate profits were contributing significantly to inflation. In fact, in some sectors, profit margins, not wages or raw materials, were the main driver of price growth. This turned the inflation narrative on its head. It wasn't just about supply and demand anymore, it was about pricing behavior. When people see their bills go up while companies post record profits, frustration brews, and rightly so. It becomes harder to trust the system, harder to believe the inflation story is just economics, harder to separate market logic from corporate opportunism. This discontent fuels populism, mistrust in institutions, backlash against globalization, pressure for price controls or windfall taxes. Inflation becomes not just a financial issue, but a social and political flashpoint. The corporate profit surge during inflation taught us three things. First, that market power matters. In concentrated industries, companies can raise prices more easily. Second, that transparency is crucial. Without clear data, consumers can't hold businesses accountable. And third, that economic narratives shape behavior. When people believe inflation is inevitable, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. This wasn't just an economic lesson, it was a wake-up call about how interconnected, fragile, and manipulable our global system really is. If you were affected by any of this, leave a comment down below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.